All right, well, good morning. It's a beautiful day here today. Rocky is going over there to lay down in the field. As you can see, it's quite a nice day. All right, I'll tell you another story about my grandpa, my dad's dad. Actually, it's a story about my grandpa, sort of, but it's more a story about the town bum. You know, in my hometown, we had he was sort of like Otis the drunk from the Andy Griffith show. This fella, he was basically a hobo. He lived in the town there, and in the summertime, I think he just laid down and slept wherever he could find a soft spot to do so. But we have pretty harsh winters in this part of the world, and in the early 1970s especially, the winters were really harsh. And you could die living outside at that time. And so that factors into the story anyway. But this hobo, his name was Lornie. I can't remember his last name. I don't even know if I ever knew his last name. I do remember him, because when I was a little kid, he used to stand on the corner downtown, and anybody passing by, he'd put his hand out, and he'd say, "Can you give me a quarter for a can of beans?" And if you gave him a quarter, of course, he'd go across the street to the hotel, to the beverage room, and get himself a beer. That was the thing. But he was a character, anyway. He was a harmless sort. He'd never really do anything to hurt you. He was just a good-natured, harmless old, alcoholic kind of a guy who just wasn't able to function in society, really. And so he had his own ways of getting by. Anyway, all this factors into the story, but I'll tell you the story about my grandpa first to set the background up. And also, I'll have to bring Dr. Church, who was one of our local doctors in town. He factors into the story too. I'll start out with Dr. Church's role in the whole thing. Dr. Church still did house calls. In the early 1970s, he still did house calls. And Dr. Church owned a 1959 Cadillac sedan with the huge tail fins. Anybody who's ever seen the rear end of one of those cars knows what I mean. It looks like a Dracula car. The huge high tail fins on it and stuff. Anyway, he owned one of those. And when he'd do a house call, and back then they had what they called doctor's plates, and a doctor's plate entitled you to park wherever you darn well pleased, pretty much, if you were a doctor, if you had to park somewhere where you normally wouldn't be allowed to in order to go and see somebody, you could do it. Anyway, he used to leave his car in the middle of the street. He wouldn't pull over to the curb. He'd just literally drive up in front of the house wherever he was going to do a house call, and he wouldn't crank the wheel, and pull up against the curb. He'd just stop right in the center of the street, leave his car there while he went in to see the person. Well, one day, it was in the wintertime, and the streets were slippery because there had been a snowstorm. And one day, my grandpa comes around the corner, and blocking his lane is Dr. Church's 1959 Cadillac. My grandpa was driving a 1967 Pontiac Straddle Chief sedan at that time, a wine-colored Pontiac Straddle Chief. I remember that car really well. Anyway, he come around the corner, and this is in front of him. Now, we couldn't go around it because coming towards him was an old beat-up car full of teenagers, and they were going like crazy, they were really moving. And so he had to make a choice. He was either going to slam into the back end of Dr. Church's car, or he was going to hit the carload of teenagers head on. So he had to make a decision anyway, and he chose the lesser of two evils, which was to slam into the back end of Dr. Church's car. Well, of course, the cops came. They charged my grandpa for ass-ending Dr. Church's car, because if you hit a car from behind, no matter what the situation, it's automatically your fault under the law. So then my grandpa had to go to court because of this charge. Now, here's where the hobo, the local hobo there, our town hobo, our version of Otis the drunk, Lornie, comes into the story. Every fall, or ever early on in the winter or whatever, you know, when the snow fell and so on, and Lornie realized that he wasn't going to survive unless he got inside, Lornie would commit some minor crime. He'd go into a restaurant and order a meal and not pay for it or something. And he'd do this so that he could get thrown into the jail, you know. Anyway, Lornie was in court that day to start his winter vacation. You know, I mean, Lornie liked being in jail because the guards trusted him. They knew he wanted to be there, so they weren't worried about him escaping, and he wasn't a troublesome sort. They understood he just didn't want to freeze to death. That's why he was there, so they treated him well. He was trusted. He pretty much had the run of the jail, and he used to work in the kitchen. Of course, he could make his home brew and everything so he could drink throughout the winter, because he could make that in the kitchen, you know. Nobody bothered Lornie, really. I mean, it was just understood that he was just trying to survive, you know. Anyway, Lornie was in court to start his winter vacation anyway. The judge's name was D.C. Smith. I don't know what the D.C. stood for, but we used to always see it in the newspaper years ago that Judge D.C. Smith had sentenced somebody to jail or whatever, you know. Anyway, it was Judge D.C. Smith was the name of the judge. And that was the judge that heard my grandpa's case, and it was the judge that heard Lornie's case, and a bunch of other cases that day. Anyway, when my grandpa was waiting for his case to come up, they brought Lornie in. Lornie had to stand in front of the judge, and of course the prosecutor told the story about what Lornie had done and why he was there, you know, what the circumstances that had brought him there, whatever minor crime he had committed. Anyway, Lornie pleaded guilty, and no, he wanted to go to jail, eh? He pleaded guilty. So Judge Smith, he says, all right, Lornie, that'll be a month on the hill, which was in the jail, you know, he called it on the hill. That'll be a month on the hill. And Lornie, he says, oh, come on, Smitty, have a heart. It's goddamn cold out there. Judge Smith started to laugh anyway. He says, oh, all right, Lornie, he says, 5 months. It's like that. All right, Lornie, he said, that'll be 5 months on the hill. Lornie says, that's better. You know, then they took Lornie away to the jail anyway, which was behind the courthouse. They used to take you out through a back door of the courthouse, and they could walk you across the jail yard from the back of the courthouse into the jail, you know. So that's what they did anyway. The jail is abandoned now since 1992, I believe, and it's in bad shape. They say it's haunted. They did hangings there and everything. They say it's haunted by a fellow who was hung there, and it's also haunted by the fellow who used to run it, the caretaker or whatever, the warden or whatever he was that used to run it, and the warden's wife. And they used to also keep indigent people there, and people who were disabled and couldn't fend for themselves. There was an old blind woman who lived there for quite a while, and she was looked after by the jailer's wife, who apparently was quite a kind-hearted woman. In fact, at one point, they wanted to move that woman to a hospital, and she begged them not to because she wanted to stay at the jail and be cared for by the jailer's wife because she thought so much of her, you know, and she just wanted to be there. That had gotten to be home to her, really, you know. Anyway, this is all back in the 1800s. It's an old jail. I believe it was built in 1862, although I could be wrong about the exact year. It's up for sale now, but I don't know who would buy it. No, it's in pretty rough shape. Anyway, bottom line is, I'm making some potatoes here and some beans. Bottom line is, anyway, Lornie went away for his vacation. That's what it was. Yeah, but my grandpa always laughed about that anyway. He used to tell that story about Lornie, you know, and he used to always get a real laugh out of it, you know. I suppose it almost made being in court for rear-ending Dr. Church's Cadillac worth it, just to have that story to tell, really, you know. Anyway, that's it for now. Just thought I'd share that with you. That was my dad's father. Wonderful, wonderful person he was, my grandpa, my grandpa Fournier. And my grandma Fournier, too. They were like second parents to me, really. Their house was the place I used to go, It was a place where I could just be a kid and I could be safe. And, I don't know what I would have done had I not had them. Anyway, that's it for now. Yeah, we'll talk to you later.